The sun rose slowly over the quiet town of Willow Creek, a small farming place in Texas where everyone seemed to know everyone else. In this town, mornings always started with the same familiar sounds: roosters crowing, the creak of barn doors opening, and tractors humming in the distance. It was a place where life moved at its own slow pace, where people gathered at the same diner every morning, and where stories traveled faster than the wind. On the edge of this town lived Martha Reynolds. She was a 46-year-old woman with kind eyes, a tired smile, and hands that had worked too hard for too long. Her little house stood beside a dirt road lined with tall, dry grass. The wooden fence leaned forward as if it too had grown tired over the years. Martha's garden was small but neat. She loved taking care of it even when she had nothing else left. Her husband had built that house many years ago with his own hands, and every corner held a memory. Life had not always been so heavy for Martha. Once upon a time, she was known for her laughter, her famous homemade pies, and her warm hospitality. People from all over the town would stop by her porch to sit, eat, and talk. But those days felt like another lifetime now. Her husband had passed away a few years earlier after a long illness. The hospital bills, funeral expenses, and farm repairs had slowly swallowed everything she had saved. At first, she tried to stay strong. She worked long hours, baking for neighbors, cleaning houses, and doing small jobs. But it was never enough. The debt grew quietly like weeds in an untended garden. She owed the bank more than she could ever pay. One by one, her small possessions disappeared. The tractor was sold, the old truck was gone, and the barn grew emptier each year. Willow Creek was not an unkind town, but it was small, and in small towns, people talk. When Martha walked down Main Street to buy bread or flour, she could feel the whispers around her. She could see the way some people looked at her, not with hate, but with pity or worse, judgment. She should have managed better, one woman would say at the bakery. "She's drowning in debt," a man at the gas station would whisper. "Poor thing, but what can anyone do?" someone else would sigh. And though no one ever said it to her face, Martha knew the word they often used behind her back: burden. She was not a burden by choice. She was a woman who had loved deeply, worked honestly, and lost painfully. But the world does not always understand quiet struggles. It only sees the outside, the unpaid bills, the old house, the tired eyes. Every night, Martha sat by her small window with a cup of weak coffee. She looked out at the land, her land, stretching far into the distance. She had inherited it from her parents, and it was the one thing that connected her to her roots. But even that land was no longer truly hers. The bank had sent her letters one after another, warning her that if she didn't pay soon, they would take it away. She kept those letters hidden in a wooden box beneath her bed. She could not bring herself to read them again. One morning, she received another notice. This one was different. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was final. The bank was putting her land up for auction. She had a few weeks left before everything she had ever owned would belong to someone else. She sat at her kitchen table, the paper trembling in her hand. The sun was warm on her face, but she felt cold inside. For years she had carried her pain quietly, trying to solve everything alone, but now it was bigger than she could handle. She whispered to herself, "It's just land. It's just a house." But deep inside she knew it was more than that. It was her history. It was where her husband had smiled at her for the first time. It was where she had planted her first tree. It was where she had buried her dreams and her hopes. Losing it would mean losing a part of herself. As the days passed, the whole town came to know about the upcoming auction. Some people pitied her, some ignored her, and some whispered behind her back even louder. Martha continued with her small daily routines, pretending not to care, but at night the silence in her house grew louder than ever. She didn't have any family left to help her. Her parents were gone. She had no children. A few friends visited her sometimes, bringing warm food and gentle words, but no one could stop the auction. She thought about leaving the town after the sale. She thought about starting somewhere else even though she had nothing left to start with. Then came the day before the auction. The wind that evening was calm. The sky was painted with soft orange and pink. Martha sat on her porch, rocking slowly in her old wooden chair. The chair creaked softly, just like it did when her husband used to sit beside her. She closed her eyes and remembered the old days. The laughter, the music, the smell of fresh pies cooling on the window. It almost felt real for a moment. But the truth soon returned like a shadow. Tomorrow, everything would be gone. At that same moment, across town, a man named James Carter watched the sunset from his own large ranch. James was a quiet cowboy, known for his honesty and his simple way of living. He owned several pieces of land and cattle, but he never acted proud about it. He wore old boots, a dusty hat, and a soft smile that never seemed forced. James knew about Martha's situation. Everyone in Willow Creek did. But unlike others, he didn't just whisper about it. He remembered a time when he had almost lost everything too, many years ago, when a storm destroyed his barn and wiped out half of his cattle. People had called him a fool for not giving up, but a few kind neighbors had helped him back then. And he had never forgotten that feeling. As he sat on his porch, James thought about Martha. He remembered the pies she used to bring to the town fair, the kindness in her voice and the way she never asked for anything, even when life was unkind to her. She was not a burden to him. She was someone who had given this town a part of herself, and gotten little in return. Meanwhile, Martha prepared for the auction in silence. She took out her best dress, the same one she had worn at her husband's funeral, and hung it on the door. She didn't have fancy clothes, but she wanted to walk into that room with dignity. She wanted to show the world that even if she was losing everything, she would not bow her head in shame. That night, she walked around her land one last time. She ran her hands over the wooden fence, touched the rough bark of the old oak tree, and stood by the small pond that had dried halfway over the years. Tears filled her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She had cried enough. In the distance, the town lights flickered softly. Life went on for everyone else. But for Martha, tomorrow was going to change everything. She whispered to the wind, "Thank you for holding me all these years." She didn't know what would happen at the auction. She didn't expect miracles. She only hoped for peace, the kind that comes when you accept your fate with grace. As the night grew deeper, she returned to her little house and sat by the window again. The old clock ticked steadily on the wall. Outside, the stars shone quietly over the fields. Martha didn't sleep much that night. Her mind replayed memories like old black and white pictures, her wedding day, planting crops with her husband, the laughter of summer evenings, the smell of rain after long, dry weeks. Tomorrow, strangers would walk on that same land. Tomorrow, someone else would hold the title to her past. But tonight, it was still hers. And in that small truth, she found a kind of strength she didn't know she still had. Far across town, James Carter also sat awake, staring at the deed papers of one of his unused lands. Something in his heart told him tomorrow was not just another auction day. He didn't have a plan, but he had a feeling. And sometimes, in quiet towns like Willow Creek, feelings could change lives in ways no one expected. The wind moved softly through the night, carrying with it stories of two people, one woman holding on to her past and one man quietly preparing to change her future. The morning of the auction arrived with a strange stillness in the air. The sun was soft and pale, peeking through the thin clouds as if even the sky was holding its breath. Birds hopped from one fence post to another, singing their little songs, unaware that for Martha Reynolds this was not just another morning. This was the day she would walk into a room and watch the last piece of her world slip through her fingers. She woke up before the sun rose. The little alarm clock on her nightstand rang at 5 o'clock, but she was already awake. She hadn't slept properly all night. Her hands trembled a little as she put the kettle on the stove to make her usual weak coffee. The house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock and the low creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet. She took a slow sip and stared out the window at her land, the same view she had known her entire life. She noticed how the sunlight slowly touched the dry fields, how the wind moved gently through the grass, and how the old oak tree swayed slightly. She had walked that land 1,000 times. She knew every rock, every bush, every sound. Soon it would no longer be hers. That thought pressed on her heart like a weight. Martha dressed in her simple best, the same dark blue dress she had ironed the night before. It was a little worn at the edges, but it was clean, neat, and it carried memories. She brushed her gray-streaked hair carefully, pinned it back, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her with tired but steady eyes. She wasn't a weak woman. Life had thrown storms at her before, and she had stood through them all. Today would be no different. She locked the door gently behind her as she stepped out. The soft crunch of gravel beneath her old shoes echoed in the still air. The auction would take place at the town's old courthouse. a small square building made of red bricks that had stood there for nearly 100 years. Every major event in Willow Creek seemed to happen in that building, from weddings to town meetings to now, the auction of her land. As she walked down the road toward town, a few neighbors glanced at her from their porches. Some nodded politely. Others looked away, pretending to be busy watering their plants or fixing something near their doors. Martha wasn't angry with them. She understood. People often didn't know what to say to someone who was losing everything. When she reached Main Street, the town was already beginning to wake up. The bakery smelled like warm bread. The barbershop door creaked open as the owner swept the front steps. The diner had its first customers, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. But today, the usual small talk had changed. Today, everyone seemed to be talking about the auction. "She's really going through with it," someone whispered from behind her. "I heard the bank won't give her any more time," another voice said softly. "She doesn't have a chance," someone muttered. Martha kept walking. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had heard it all before. When she arrived at the courthouse steps, a few people were already gathered outside. Some were just curious, wanting to see who would buy the land. Others were interested bidders, local farmers, small business owners, maybe even someone from outside town. Her heart squeezed tightly at the thought. She had always imagined growing old on that land, not watching strangers fight over it with raised hands and numbers. Inside the building, the air smelled of old wood and polished floors. The long benches were filled with townspeople, some whispering, some just staring. At the front stood a tall wooden podium where the auctioneer, Mr. Benson, prepared his papers. He was a serious man with gray hair and thick glasses, known for speaking fast and wasting no time. Martha took a seat near the back. She wanted to be there, but also not be seen too much. She folded her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. And then, just as the auction was about to begin, the sound of boots echoed through the hallway. Heads turned. James Carter walked in. He wore his usual cowboy hat, faded jeans, and a simple shirt. His boots made a steady sound on the wooden floor as he made his way inside. People whispered the moment they saw him. "James Carter's here," someone said, surprised. "What does he want with her land?" Another whispered. "He has more land than anyone in this town," a man muttered. James gave no sign of hearing any of it. He simply tipped his hat politely to Mr. Benson, then found a place to stand near the front. He didn't need to sit. His calm presence seemed to fill the room quietly. Martha saw him and felt a small knot of confusion in her chest. She didn't know James very well. She had spoken to him only a few times at community events, mostly about ordinary things like the weather or farm work. He was a kind man, but he was also private. She couldn't imagine why he would be here. The auctioneer cleared his throat loudly, breaking the low whispers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing across the room. "Today we have for auction the Reynolds property. 40 acres of land on the south side of town, including the house, barn, and well." A hush fell over the room. Mr. Benson adjusted his glasses, looked at his paper, and began. "We'll start the bidding at $20,000. Who will start us off?" For a moment no one moved. Then slowly a hand went up. A man named Mr. Grant, who owned the hardware store. Then another hand, a woman from the next town over. Martha's heart began to beat faster as the numbers climbed. She didn't understand much about auctions, but she could hear the rising amounts. 25, Mr. Benson called. 30, someone shouted. 32, came another voice. Martha sat perfectly still, but inside everything was trembling. This was it. This was the moment when the world she had built piece by piece was being pulled away, number by number. And then James Carter lifted his hand. The room fell quiet for a heartbeat. When James made a bid, people paid attention. 50,000, he said in a calm, steady voice, every head turned. Even Mr. Benson paused for a second. That was a number higher than anyone expected for that land. It wasn't fancy land, it was old, dry, and needed work. But James said the number like it was nothing. The other bidders shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered to each other. Mr. Grant frowned and lowered his hand. The woman from the other town hesitated but didn't raise the bid. Slowly, one by one, people began to drop out. Martha stared at James, her heart thumping. Why would he do that? Why would a man with so much land bid on hers? Mr. Benson looked around the room. "Do I hear 55? He asked. No one answered. 55 going once. He raised his voice. Going twice. The gavel came down with a loud thunk. Sold. To Mr. James Carter. The sound seemed to echo in Martha's ears. Just like that, the land was gone. The whispers grew louder again, like a breeze moving through dry grass. Some people looked surprised. Others nodded like they expected nothing less from a man like James. Martha sat there quietly, trying to breathe. She had known this would happen. She had known the land would go to someone else. She just hadn't expected it to be him. James stepped forward and signed the papers with a firm hand. Mr. Benson shook his hand and handed him the deed. But James didn't leave. He turned around slowly and walked toward the back of the room where Martha sat. The whispers grew even louder. Martha looked up at him, confused. She had no idea what to say. James stopped right in front of her. He held the envelope with the deed inside. His voice was calm, just like always. Martha, he said softly, come with me outside for a moment. She blinked at him. Why? She whispered. But he didn't answer. Curious faces followed them as they stepped out of the old courthouse. The sun was brighter now, the air warmer, but Martha felt lightheaded. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't understand what was happening. James stood on the steps holding the envelope. He looked at her, not with pity, not with pride, but with quiet kindness. You've carried a lot on your shoulders, Martha, he said gently. I've seen it. Everyone has. But I don't think anyone ever did anything real to help you. Martha frowned slightly, confused. What are you saying, James? He opened the envelope, took out the deed, and held it out to her. I didn't buy this land to take it from you, he said. I bought it to give it back. For a moment, everything froze. The sound of birds, the chatter from inside, even the wind seemed to stop. Martha stared at the paper in his hand as if it were something unreal. James continued, his voice steady. This land belongs to someone who has loved it with everything she had. That's you, Martha. You built your life here, and no one should take that away just because times got hard. She shook her head slightly. I can't take that, she whispered. You can, he said firmly. And you will. Tears filled Martha's eyes, but she didn't want to cry in front of everyone. She covered her mouth with her hand, shaking slightly. James gently placed the deed into her hands. This is yours, he said. No conditions, no tricks. It's yours. People inside had begun to come out, their whispers turning into stunned silence. No one had expected this. No one. And for the first time in a long, long while, Martha felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. For many people in Willow Creek, the story should have ended on those courthouse steps. A kind man gives a woman her land back and life becomes peaceful again. But real life is never that simple. Sometimes, even when kindness enters a person's life like sunlight, the shadows of doubt and pain remain for a while. When Martha walked back home that day, the paper with the land title in her hands, her steps were unsteady. Her mind was still trying to understand what had happened. Just a few hours earlier, she had thought she would lose everything she loved. And now suddenly she had it all back. It felt unreal, like a dream she might wake up from. She pressed the paper to her chest as if holding it tightly would stop the world from taking it away again. But as she walked down Main Street, she heard the whispers begin again. Not soft and pitying this time, but sharp and curious. Did you see what he did? Someone said. I knew James had a soft heart, another replied. Or maybe he has his own reasons. Someone else added in a low voice. People talked in small towns. It was something Martha had grown used to. But this time their whispers carried a different weight. Some said James had done it because he liked her. Some said he must want something in return. Some said no man would give away that kind of money without expecting something back. Martha didn't want to listen, but their words floated in the air like smoke, seeping in through cracks she didn't even know existed. She lowered her head and walked faster, clutching the deed as if it were a fragile piece of glass. When she finally reached her little house, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it, breathing slowly. The house felt different now. It wasn't going to be taken from her anymore. But the silence inside was still heavy. The pain of years of struggle didn't disappear in a single day. She went out to her porch and sat on the old wooden chair. The field stretched out in front of her, golden in the late afternoon light. The wind blew softly, carrying the smell of earth and dry grass. For the first time in years, the land was truly hers again, and yet her heart wasn't calm. She thought about James. Why would he do something so big for her? He could have just stayed home like everyone else. He didn't owe her anything. She wasn't family. They were barely friends. His kindness confused her as much as it warmed her heart. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the wooden ceiling. The moonlight slipped through the curtains, lighting up the room with a soft glow. She remembered the look on James's face when he gave her the deed. Steady, kind, but not proud. He hadn't done it to show off. He had done it because he believed she deserved it, but the voices from town echoed in her mind. He must want something. Nobody gives away that much for nothing. Her chest tightened. The idea that his kindness could be twisted by others hurt her deeply. She didn't want his name to be dragged through whispers because of her. She didn't want people to think he had done something wrong. The next morning, Martha walked into town again, this time to buy flour from the bakery. She needed to keep living her life no matter what people said, but as soon as she entered, a few heads turned. "Good morning, Martha," the baker said kindly. But behind her, a woman whispered to another. "She's lucky," the woman said. "Or smart," the other whispered back with a little laugh. Martha's heart sank, but she kept her chin up. She paid for her flour, thanked the baker, and walked out. When she reached the edge of town, James's truck pulled up beside her. He leaned out of the window with his usual calm smile. "Morning, Martha," he said. "Need a ride home?" She hesitated. Part of her wanted to say yes, but another part was afraid that if someone saw them together, the whispers would only grow louder. She forced a polite smile. "No, thank you, James, I'll walk." His smile faded just a little, but he didn't push. "All right," he said softly. "Take care, then." As he drove away, guilt tugged at her heart. He had done something good for her, and she was pushing him away. But she didn't know how to handle all this. For years she had lived quietly, with no one looking at her except with pity. Now everyone was watching. Over the next few weeks, Martha tried to settle back into her daily life. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, fixed the fence as best she could, and began tending her small garden again. She planted flowers and vegetables, something she hadn't done in years because she had always feared the land would be taken away. For a few moments each day, she felt something close to peace. But inside, a storm kept swirling. She worried about what people said about James. She worried about being seen as someone who had accepted charity. She had always been proud of working for everything she had. Now it felt like she was carrying a gift too heavy for her shoulders. One afternoon, James came to visit. He parked his truck outside her house and knocked gently on the door. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding. "Hi," he said with a warm smile. "I was just checking if everything's all right with the fence. I saw it leaning a little when I passed by last time." Martha forced a smile. "It's fine, James, I can handle it." He nodded, not offended, but concerned. "I know you can, but I've got some spare wood and tools. It won't take long." Martha hesitated. Part of her wanted to say yes. Part of her wanted to tell him not to bother. "James," she said finally, "you've already done more than enough for me." He looked at her with gentle eyes. "Martha, this isn't about doing more for you. You're my neighbor. That's what neighbors do. We help each other." His words were simple, but they cut through the noise in her head. For a moment, she saw the truth. He didn't see her as a burden. He saw her as someone worth standing beside. She nodded quietly, and together they worked on the fence that afternoon. They didn't talk much, just the sound of hammering and the rustle of wind through the fields. It reminded her of the old days when her husband used to work out here. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. But as the sun set and James drove away, the whispers returned in her mind. He must want something. She knew those words didn't come from him. They came from people who didn't understand, but they still hurt. Later that week, Martha overheard a conversation at the general store. A group of women stood near the counter talking in low voices. "James Carter must be in love with her," one woman said. "Or maybe she promised him something," another replied with a laugh. "She's not fooling anyone," a third added. Martha froze in place, the can of beans in her hand shaking. They weren't whispering softly anymore. Their words were sharp, heavy, and careless. She left the store quickly, her heart pounding. She wasn't angry at them. She was hurt. They didn't know her story. They didn't know James's heart. They only knew how to talk. That night, she sat on the porch again, staring at the fields under the moonlight. She asked herself if she deserved the kindness James had shown. Maybe they were right. Maybe it wasn't fair for her to accept so much from someone without giving anything in return. She thought about giving the land back. She even took out the deed and placed it on the table, staring at it for hours. It would be easier, she thought, to live with nothing than to live with so many eyes watching her. But then she remembered his words on the courthouse steps. This land belongs to someone who has loved it with everything she had. That's you, Martha. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away this time. For so long she had fought her battles alone, but maybe, just maybe, accepting kindness was not weakness. Maybe it was strength too. Still, the road ahead wasn't easy. She would have to face the town's whispers. She would have to learn to trust James's heart. And most of all, she would have to learn to forgive herself for needing help. As the wind moved gently through the night, Martha whispered to the stars, "I'm not a burden." She said it softly, almost as if she needed to hear it herself. And though the world around her hadn't changed, something inside her did. It was small, fragile, but real. A spark of courage that would grow in the days to come. The wind moved softly through the fields of Willow Creek as another morning began. The sun rose slowly over the quiet land, painting the sky with warm colors. Martha sat on her porch holding a cup of coffee in both hands. She had sat in this same spot many mornings before, but now it felt different. The land stretched out in front of her like a promise. For the first time in years, it was hers without fear of losing it. Still, the weight of people's whispers hadn't disappeared. The town still talked. They always would. But something inside Martha had begun to change. She no longer felt as small as their words. The days after James gave her the land were filled with quiet struggle and small victories. At first, she had avoided him, not because she was ungrateful, but because she didn't know how to face him without feeling a storm of emotions she couldn't explain. But James never forced her. He didn't show up every day, and he didn't ask for anything. He just went on with his life, giving her space like someone who understood the value of silence. Then one late afternoon, she saw him fixing the broken fence on the north side of her property. He hadn't even knocked or asked. He was just there, hammering away under the setting sun. Martha watched him for a long moment from her porch. She wanted to tell him to stop, that he had already done enough, but something in his quiet way told her it wasn't about what he had to do. It was about what he wanted to do. She walked over slowly. "James," she called. He looked up, brushing the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Evening, Martha," he said with a small smile. "You don't have to do this," she said gently. "I know," he replied simply. "But it's a good fence. It just needs someone to care for it." His words settled deep in her heart. For years, no one had stood beside her like this. She had learned to fight alone. But James didn't come to take control. He came to stand beside her. There was a quiet power in that. In the days that followed, Martha began to rebuild her farm, not all at once, but piece by piece. She repaired the old barn roof with the help of a few kind neighbors who, slowly and carefully, started to show up again. Not everyone in town was cruel. Many people had just been silent, unsure of what to say or how to help. When they saw Martha working, they realized she wasn't just someone to whisper about. She was someone strong who had survived storms. A few children from town began visiting her farm after school. Martha had always loved teaching them about planting and animals when she was younger. Now she welcomed them back, showing them how to water the plants, how to feed the chickens, how to take care of the soil. Their laughter filled the air like music, replacing the heavy silence that had lived on her land for too long. James visited sometimes, but never in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. He helped when needed, but he also gave her the space to build her life with her own two hands. She admired that about him. He was kind, but never pushy, but not everyone changed overnight. There were still whispers in town. At the bakery, at the diner, near the gas station, people still wondered why James had done what he did. Some even questioned Martha's worth. But something inside her had grown stronger since the auction day. She had stopped letting other people's voices decide her worth. One morning, as she walked into the diner for a cup of coffee, she overheard two women at a corner booth whispering. "She must have done something to get that land back," one woman said. "No one gives away that much for free." Martha paused, then turned and walked toward them. For the first time, she didn't lower her head. She stood tall with quiet strength in her eyes. "You're right," she said softly. "No one gives away something for free. But kindness isn't about what you get. It's about what you give without asking for anything back." James did something kind. And I'm not ashamed of accepting it. I'll spend the rest of my life honoring that kindness, not running from it." The women didn't answer. They just looked at her surprised. Martha didn't wait for a reply. She walked to the counter, ordered her coffee, and sat by the window. And for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of the woman looking back at her in the reflection of the glass. That moment was a turning point. Not because the town suddenly stopped talking, but because Martha stopped letting it control her heart. She started holding her head a little higher. She smiled more. She walked with a steadier step. Meanwhile, James continued to live simply just as he always had. But his quiet gesture at the auction had changed not only Martha's life, but something in the town as well. People began to look at kindness differently. Some started helping their neighbors more, not with loud promises, but with quiet, steady actions. One day, as summer came closer, Martha decided to do something she had dreamed of for years but never thought she'd get the chance to do again. She wanted to turn her land into a small community farm, a place where people could work together, grow food, and share it with others. It wouldn't be big or fancy, but it would be hers. She spent days planning. She drew simple sketches on paper at her kitchen table, sometimes late into the night. She calculated costs, made lists of seeds, and wrote down everything she needed. She even went to town to ask the local store owners if they had any old tools they didn't use anymore. At first, some people were unsure, but then something beautiful happened. One by one, people began to offer help. Someone donated seeds. Another offered wooden planks for garden beds. A few teenagers offered to help build fences on weekends. Even the people who once whispered began to show up quietly with small things. Not because they felt sorry for her, but because they wanted to be part of something good. James, of course, was there too. He stood beside her during the first day of planting, helping dig holes for the saplings. But he let her lead. She was the heart of the place. Weeks turned into months. The farm began to bloom. Rows of vegetables stretched across the fields. Bright flowers danced in the breeze. The sound of laughter and friendly voices filled the air. Martha worked harder than ever, but now the work didn't feel heavy. It felt meaningful. One evening, as the sun set over the golden fields, Martha stood at the edge of her land. The sky was painted with soft orange and pink, just like the night before the auction. But this time there was no fear in her heart. She could hear the chatter of people working on the farm behind her, children laughing, and the soft sound of wind passing through the crops. James walked up beside her, his hat tilted slightly against the sun. "You've built something beautiful here, Martha," he said quietly. She looked at him and smiled. "No," she replied softly. "We built something beautiful," he chuckled. "All I did was give you a piece of paper. You did the real work." She shook her head gently. "No, James, you gave me more than that. You gave me a second chance, and that's something I'll never forget." For a long moment they stood there together, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The land was no longer a place of loss. It was alive again. It was full of hope, full of people, full of stories waiting to be told. Martha knew there would still be challenges. There would be hard days. There would be more whispers. But she had faced storms before, and she had survived. This time she had more than her strength. She had a community. She had hope. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned something she wished she had known long ago. Accepting kindness is not weakness. It is a different kind of strength. When the stars began to appear in the night sky, Martha whispered softly, "Thank you." Though she wasn't just talking to James. She was thanking life itself for not giving up on her when she had almost given up on herself. The sun shone softly over Willow Creek, lighting up the fields like a golden blanket. The farm that once stood silent and broken was now alive with movement and laughter. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh earth, blooming flowers, and ripening vegetables. It had been months since the day of the auction, the day everything changed for Martha Reynolds. Life on the farm had grown in quiet, beautiful steps. It wasn't perfect, but it was full of life. Where there was once silence, there was now the sound of footsteps, children playing, tools clinking, and birds singing in the trees. People from the town came and went, bringing seeds, tools, and smiles. Some worked, some talked, some simply came to enjoy the peace of the place. The land that had once been a burden in people's eyes had turned into a symbol of hope. Martha walked through the rows of vegetables, her hands brushing lightly over the leaves. She could still remember the fear that once lived in her chest. The fear of losing everything, of being seen as weak, of being called a burden. But that fear no longer owned her. She had faced it. She had walked through it. And now every green leaf, every flower, every voice on this farm was proof that life can change in ways no one expects. Sometimes she still heard whispers in town, but now they were different. People talked about how her farm had brought the community together. They spoke of the way she had turned something broken into something beautiful. She had become a quiet example of strength, not because she never fell, but because she learned to stand back up. James still visited often, though their friendship was never rushed or forced. He would stop by with a small bag of feed for the chickens or a new tool for the shed. Sometimes they worked side by side without saying much. Other times they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the fields, talking softly about life, the land, and their shared love for quiet evenings. The whispers about him and Martha had not disappeared completely, but they had lost their power. People now saw something else in respect. They saw a man who gave without asking, and a woman who took that kindness and built something greater than anyone expected. One warm afternoon, Martha sat under the big oak tree at the edge of her farm. This was the same tree where she had once stood on the night before the auction, thinking she was about to lose everything. The memory came back to her like a quiet movie in her mind. She remembered the fear, the sadness, the weight pressing on her heart. She remembered whispering to the wind, saying goodbye. But the tree had stood firm through it all, the storms, the heat, the dry seasons. Just like her, a group of children ran past her, their laughter ringing out like music. They were carrying baskets of fresh vegetables, proudly taking them to the small wooden stand at the front of the farm, where townspeople could come and take what they needed. The farm didn't make much money. It wasn't meant to. It was built on something different: kindness, sharing, and second chances. Martha smiled softly as she watched them. Once upon a time, she had thought her story was ending. But now she realized it had only been a new beginning. That evening, she stood at the wooden stand as people from town came by. Some picked vegetables, some brought small things in return: a loaf of bread, fresh eggs, or jars of honey. It wasn't about value in money. It was about connection. An older woman approached her and took her hand gently. "Martha," she said with a warm smile, "this farm has changed the way people talk around here. You've given us something to believe in again." Martha felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I didn't do it alone," she replied softly. "I just stopped being afraid to accept help." The woman squeezed her hand. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing of all." Later that night, when the sun had set and the stars began to fill the sky, Martha sat on her porch with a soft blanket wrapped around her shoulders. James sat beside her in his usual spot, his boots resting on the wooden porch rail. They didn't need many words. Their silence was easy, warm, and full of understanding. "You've done something special here, Martha," James said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the calm night air. She looked at him, a gentle smile on her lips. "We've done something special here," she corrected him softly. He tilted his head slightly and smiled back. "I just handed you a piece of paper. You're the one who gave it life again." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "James, that piece of paper was more than land. It was hope. And hope can build a lot more than fences." They both looked out over the fields. The moonlight touched the crops like a silver glow. It was a quiet moment, but it carried more meaning than any loud celebration ever could. Martha thought about how much had changed in such a short time. Not just the land, but her. The woman who once walked down Main Street with her head down now walked with quiet strength. The woman who had once hidden her pain in silence now shared her story with others, not for attention, but to remind them that hope can grow even from the hardest soil. The farm had also changed the way people in town saw each other. Neighbors who barely spoke before now worked side by side in the fields. People who once stayed quiet now reached out to help one another. It wasn't magic. It was kindness, shared again and again, growing like a strong tree with deep roots. One morning, a young woman from town came to Martha's farm. She was nervous, holding her hat in her hands, and her voice trembled when she spoke. "Martha," she said softly, "I'm going through something hard. I don't know what to do, but I saw what you did. I saw how you stood back up, and I just thought, maybe if you can do it, I can too." Martha looked at her, and for a moment she saw her younger self, scared, tired, and carrying the world alone. She gently took the young woman's hand and said, "Yes, you can." And just like that, a new story began to grow in someone else's heart. Martha realized then that her pain, her fear, and even the whispers had all led her here, not just to save her land, but to help others see what was possible. In the months that followed, she wrote down her story in a small notebook, not to publish it, not to make a name for herself, but to remember the nights she thought she had nothing left, to remember the moment a cowboy handed her a piece of paper that became her second chance, to remember the whispers that once broke her and the strength that rose quietly inside her. One day she placed the notebook inside a small wooden box and buried it under the big oak tree. She whispered softly, "This is where it all began." James watched her from a few steps away and asked, "What was that for?" She smiled. "For the past," she said simply, "and for everything it taught me." The farm became more than just land. It became a living reminder that one kind act can change many lives. People came from nearby towns to see it, not because it was big or rich, but because it felt warm. It felt like a place built with real hands, real hearts, and real hope. As time passed, Martha grew older, but her spirit remained strong. She never forgot the day she stood on the courthouse steps thinking her story was over, and she never forgot the man who chose kindness when the world had turned its back. Every year, on the same date as the auction, she hosted a small gathering at the farm. She called it Hope Day. Neighbors, children, and even strangers came together to plant something new in the soil. It could be a flower, a tree, or a vegetable plant. Each year, the farm grew more colorful, more alive. It became a place that carried not just her story, but the stories of many others who had learned to believe again. When Martha looked at her land now, she didn't see a burden. She didn't see loss. She saw love, courage, and kindness woven into every corner of it. She saw how far she had come, and how one act of giving had touched so many lives. She often thought about that moment when James placed the deed in her hands. At the time, she had felt confused, overwhelmed, even scared. But now she understood it fully. He hadn't just given her land. He had given her the chance to believe in goodness again. And she had taken that chance and turned it into something no one in Willow Creek would ever forget. As the sun set behind the fields, Martha whispered softly, "I am not a burden. I am a story." And indeed, her story had become a part of the land itself. A quiet, powerful reminder that sometimes the kindest gifts aren't just about what's given. They're about what grows afterward. The wind moved through the fields, carrying the sound of laughter and the scent of new beginnings. And under the big oak tree where it had all begun, the earth held not just roots but a legacy. One built on kindness, strength, and hope.